Thank you very much. Well, I think I've got about 60 seconds to do some work of the first national importance, which is first of all to draw your attention to the fire escapes here and at the back, and secondly, of course, to welcome you again. I think the title of today's conference is interesting. It's called Asians in Today's Australia. One might very well have alternatively entitled it Australians in Today's Asia, or as some wag remarked, yesterday's Europe. I think everybody here is an Australian, and one gets into very delicate questions of definition, as all of us here in Queensland are familiar with the delicacies of defining whether you're a Queenslander or not, and exactly how long it takes to become one. I think it's interesting that Australia has the second highest proportion in the world of citizens who are not born in the country of which they're citizens. I think Israel has the highest, and Australia has the second highest. And of course Israel is a very particular case, since whereas Australia hasn't got the same commonality of origin. And in one sense, I think that's perhaps a cause for self-congratulation in Australia that we've managed, many of us, including myself, to be first-generation Australians, and there's a good deal of community acceptance of the notion of a society of people from all over the world. On the other hand, while it's grounds in part for self-congratulations, it's certainly not grounds for smugness. I think in general, the sort of problems we're looking at today are worldwide, and I think in general my own feeling is that people in this area of intolerance towards people from elsewhere, whether it's from another village or another country or whatever, people are generally most intolerant towards people that they know that they've wronged. So I think the Americans towards the American blacks and the Australians towards Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, I think that's where our behaviour is the worst. Again, that's not to say that our behaviour is impeccable in other areas, as everybody who's here today knows. Well, I think people today will be looking, as Don suggested, to practical ways of overcoming problems of the sort that the conference is about. That is, how do we build a multicultural society with a diversity but nonetheless some commonality? And I think I won't go on any longer about that from my profound and wide-ranging ignorance. I'll move to my very pleasant task of welcoming Hadyn Sergeant. He's probably very well known to most of you as a broadcaster of very long standing, and if you listen to his program, which I do from time to time without being able to claim to being a regular listener, his introductory remarks always reveal, I think, his wide-ranging and sympathetic concern with a great variety of social problems, and he's very well known in the Brisbane community for that concern. So that I think we're all very grateful indeed that he's found time to fit into a busy schedule his attendance at this occasion, and we're very pleased indeed to welcome him here, and I'd ask you to join me in doing that.
Professor Siegel and ladies and gentlemen, I was a bit concerned when he mentioned about the fire escapes. I can assure you nothing that I'm going to say is that inflammatory. It may not please everybody, but I think you'll be able to leave by the normal exit if you're not happy. I just want to say thank you for the invitation, not only because of the honour you do me in inviting me, but for the mental stimulation and the challenge that this topic has been for me. I always make a habit of accepting speeches or accepting invitations to speak where I feel comfortable with the topic. And about a week ago I kept saying to myself, why on earth did I accept this invitation to speak at this conference? Because I found myself struggling with the topic. But out of that struggle I find myself, I hope, a richer person for that experience. And I hope at the end of the day today you will feel a richer person for the mental stimulation and the challenge that the topic suggests. You've chosen the theme, Asians in Today's Australia. And if I can, I'd like to suggest a topic for the few thoughts of mine, and that is simply this: positions vacant, bridge builders wanted. And I would say to you, I am not an academic. I am not a worker in the field of migrant welfare. I guess, if anything, I am just a listener to public opinion. I don't believe that I am a shaper of public opinion, but I do believe that I am a listener to public opinion. And probably because of the nature of talkback radio, we sometimes tend to get a quicker, faster, and more natural indication of public opinion than oftentimes is found in the slower and the more tedious polls, even though ultimately they perhaps may be more definitive in their accuracy. Let me begin by asking you to consider a question. Is the attitude of Australians towards migrants, and Asians in particular, as bad as some people think? I don't think so. Let's consider a few points first. This is a relatively young country. Racial intolerance and bigotry about colour and race were significant attitudes from our very earliest days. After all, the Bulletin magazine grew up on the White Australia theme. The Labor Party's first platform of policy in 1900 referred to the, and I quote, the total exclusion of coloured and other undesirable races. And they didn't take it out until 1963. In 1901, King O'Malley, a migrant himself, in the Immigration Restriction Bill debate of 1901 said, "We are here upon a continent set apart by the Creator exclusively for a southern empire, for a southern nation," he said. "And it is our duty to preserve this island continent for all eternity to the white race, irrespective of where they come from." And none other than the Prime Minister of the time, Edmund Barton, is on record as having said in that same debate in 1901, "I do not think that the doctrine of the equality of man was really ever intended to include racial equality." Now, if we left it at that, I think there'd be good reason to feel rather overwhelmed with a sense of gloom and hopelessness. But I put it to you that in spite of that beginning, the Australian population has always had a varied mix. And since World War II, we have changed the face of our community with an immigration program bolder and more radically diverse than any country in the world has attempted before or since. And I was fascinated by the comment made by Professor Siegel that Australia, in fact, has the second largest population in the world of people born outside its borders. And I think that's intriguing. In spite of the number and the diversity of ethnic groups in Australia, our society has been the most harmonious and stable in the world, in spite of the occasional hiccups caused by knee-jerk reactions to passing but tough economic times. I grew up in the industrial city of Wollongong, in the shadow of the local steelworks. My dad worked at the steelworks, my brother worked at the steelworks, I worked at the steelworks in my college and high school holidays. And after the war, our little quiet suburb overlooking Lake Illawarra, within the shadow of the steelworks, exploded with a whole heap of newcomers. Yugoslavs, British, Italians, Greeks, Poles, you name it, our suburb had them. They worked hard and they built the most awful houses. Usually it was a garage. We thought they all had cars at first. They all built garages. And they lived in these little tiny places, maybe about 30 feet long and about 12 feet wide. They accommodated at least 55 people, I think. They always had a wonderful veggie patch. And then they built on another room. Usually it was a kitchen and a laundry. And then another room. That was the lounge room. And then another room and another room. And 10 years later, they had a house much like everybody else's. The community accepted them very reluctantly. But they persevered and they carved for themselves a place in the life of Australia. They helped to build Australia in those boom years after the war. Even though some Australians couldn't see it or were reluctant to admit it. But when you stop to think about it, in spite of the arguments at the time, Australia prospered because of that migration boom. And in retrospect, Australia's debt to migration is obvious. What's more, Australia's immigration program has been an enormous success. But today we want to think a little bit more about our latest newcomers. Not the ones who broke through those crusty resentments and petty jealousies of the 40s, but rather let's think about our most recent newcomers, the Asian people. And I suggest to you first of all that somehow we have got to stop thinking about them in isolation, as some sort of appendage. Those of us in the community who do care about harmonious community relationships have got to think of them as part of the community, because that's what they are, not some sort of ragtag bunch dragging at the tail of Australian society, but an intrinsic, vital part of the community. And I suggest that we have to think about them in that light, not for their sakes, but for the sake of our own cohesion and unity. How do you discourage people and groups from thinking of themselves in isolation? How do we encourage the wider community to think of them as part of the body of society and not a tolerated burden? I'll be honest with you, I don't think we do it by talking about multiculturalism. I suggest that the word multiculturalism, of which we've heard a lot since the then Minister Ian McPhee asked the Australian Ethnic Affairs Council to consider in 1980, I think it's for the majority of Aussies a rather meaningless bit of high-sounding waffle. I'm not talking about the academics, I'm not talking about the professionals in the field, I'm talking about Mr. and Mrs. Average Australia. I think the word multiculturalism is just high-sounding waffle. I think for some, they even suspect that it might be rather sinister label for something that somebody's trying to sell them that they don't really want to buy. But in spite of the fact that the word's been bandied around since 1980, I suggest that it is only in fact understood by a handful. I'm not so sure that the word isn't a bit like the emperor's clothes. Let me illustrate. The report of the Council on Population and Ethnic Affairs in 1982 contained this quote: "Multiculturalism has given us the chance to build a remarkable nation with a distinctive and meaningful blend of cultures. as if some visionary had way back there planned all this multicultural development from the beginning. I suggest to you that what had happened was an accident. What had happened came about by necessity because they needed more people in the country. Later on, they decided to put a tag on it and call it multiculturalism. But to Mr. and Mrs. Average Australia, I don't think it has a lot of meaning. One of the things I believe we need to do as a nation is decide where we're going. Or more importantly, where we want to go in the future. Maybe that ought to be the big thing for the bicentenary. I'd like to see that question. Where do you want Australia to go? What do you want for the future of Australia? I'd like to see that question put to every high school student, every RSL, every church, every trade union, every social club, every Rotary and Lions organisation and service organisation. I'd like to see it debated in the newspapers and in television debates and on talkback radio until the whole nation is talking this one question: where do we want to go in the future? And then I'd like to be able to find some rare politicians willing to listen to the will of the people. People exercising, by the way, their constitutional and democratic rights, and politicians willing to do as they're told by the people for a change. In spite of all our shortcomings in this country, I still believe that we have an excellent overall attitude to life. I believe we are essentially a fair people, willing to give other people a go, but we need, as a body, to reinforce that spirit which sometimes exists a little too far under the surface. I'd like to see us working harder at eliminating discrimination in all its forms. Kevin Gilbert wrote in 1973, "All human beings discriminate between various levels of human behaviour and categorise them as something to which they aspire or as something which they condemn. By this process, personal standards are formed. But racist discrimination tends to describe or tends to ascribe to a whole group the patterns of behaviour that can be observed amongst the lowest individuals within the group. In short," says Gilbert, "it ceases to discriminate and becomes mere prejudice." I'm not so much concerned about building up a multicultural society. I'm more interested in a society without discrimination and prejudice, because that to me is an enlightened society. It would probably also be multicultural. Recently I was asked to speak at the speech and prize giving night of Toowong High School. The dux of the school was a Vietnamese lad, one of the boat people. His parents were still in Vietnam. I have to confess I had a lump in my throat as he came forward very modestly, very humbly, to accept his prize. But the thing that gave me the lump in my throat most was the behaviour of his peers, his fellow Australian students, who gave him the most enthusiastic, the most genuine, proud and unselfish applause and recognition that I've ever seen or heard. And I was deeply moved by that, not only by his achievement, but by their acceptance and their obvious uninhibited joy. Unfortunately, it didn't get reported. I believe most Australians, if they were encouraged to think about it, would support the concept of a society without prejudice and discrimination. And I guess it's natural to ask, is such a society just the daydreaming of an impractical idealist? I don't truthfully know. I do know, however, that our society has changed its moral views on a lot of subjects, such as slavery, torture, horrific punishment, exploitation of people, children, women, so on. But if we are to take and make further changes in our society, we need bridge builders. People who will actively build bridges between groups in the community to counter those people who actively work at building walls and creating division and creating conflict. David Scott, who wrote a book called Don't Mourn for Me, Organise, said to influence people, you need organisation, and voluntary organisations are often the best sort for that purpose. The large and diverse voluntary sector, with its many facets such as service and education, innovation, protest, advocacy, mediation, research, self-help, local action, national action, coordination, choice and involvement, that voluntary sector has vitality and dynamism. Let me put it this way. You may know, but how many people in Australia, in the Australian community, know anything about the needs and the problems of Asians today? What do we know about the aged Asians in the Australian community? What do we know about the specific problems being faced by the women? What do we know about the impact of all those years of social deprivation on the children and the teenagers? What do we know about the tensions created for those people by a community willing to accept them but unwilling to recognise their qualifications? It's not enough for academics or public servants to know that. The whole community has to know it. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, that's the media's job. I got news for you. That's not the media's job. Don't look on the media like some kind of conglomerate mouth. The media is, in fact, a lot of individuals. It's individual companies that own newspapers and radio stations and television stations and magazines. It's individual journalists and reporters and researchers and directors and producers and editors and executives and announcers. Just individuals. I read with interest the 10 points which came out of your conference last November. I thought they were pretty impractical. Don't try and develop a code of ethics for the media to deal with the ethnic section of the community, because you're making them an appendage again. If there is a code of ethics, it is for all people, not just a code of ethics for this group and a code of ethics for that group. I mean, you'd go batty, wouldn't you, looking through your little list to see about the code of ethics for this particular person. So don't suggest a code of ethics for the media, for ethnics. Let's just have a code of ethics, full stop. And most organisations do have them. Occasionally, they have to be reminded about them. You know, I think the only reason why there is a preoccupation in the media with white Anglo-Saxons is that because a lot of the decision makers, the media managers, are under the impression that there are more of them in the community than anybody else. And media is a business. Media is not an educational institution. Media is not a tool of the community. Media is in fact a business. Perhaps organisations like the ABC are to a degree free of that kind of competitive edge, although they, poor devils, have got the problem of politicians looking for money lately. But by and large, the media is a competitive business. flat out trying to cater and meet the needs of their consumers. I mean, there's no point going into your local supermarket and saying, why don't you sell noodles if there's no sale for them? If you are the only customer, it's unlikely the supermarket's going to stock them for you exclusively. If you say to the media, why don't you do this on our behalf? It's not because they don't like you, it's because they believe you are not in significant enough numbers to worry about. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to defend the media. It's big enough to do that for itself. What I would suggest to you, though, is that because the media is made up of individuals and the media is a business, you can't expect them to respond with what you see as altruistic and necessary willingness to support your particular cause. I think the media doesn't really move with any sense of real unity. But it does respond to what it sees the consuming public wants. And I think perhaps one of the best illustrations of that is the recent case of Les Pates, the young man who was in Greenslopes Hospital begging the Australian government to change their mind about financial help for a heart-lung operation. And bit by bit, as more and more people talked about this and pressured and raised the point and agitated and got the media on side, bit by bit more and more media became involved. And in the end, the politicians couldn't resist the avalanche of public opinion. It didn't start with the media, it started with the people. And it was the people who moved the media. Once the media gets rolling, it's a pretty mighty machine, but it takes people to make it move. With regard to the media and Asian migration, I think there have been some glaring inconsistencies with scare stories about the boat people and diseases and castigating the government on the one hand for not bringing in enough, and then a couple of years later castigating the government for bringing in too many. But while we're passing that point, let me just make a comment. I think when Professor Geoffrey Blainey made his first statement to that Rotary conference at Warrnambool, I think he correctly at that time read the concerns, the frustrations and the fears of a lot of Australians whose tranquility and feeling of security had been threatened by growing unemployment. But I believe the government let the migrant people down, and not only the migrant people, I believe they let down the Australian community, because the Australian community's harmony was disrupted by that whole debate. I think the government should have met that fear head on and embarked on a program of teaching, and I use that word advisedly, not propaganda, to put that migration issue into perspective. But having failed to do that, having failed to meet that challenge, I feel the government, in a sense, has to slow down that Asian migration until the community view changes, either by government education, by education from within the community by groups like yourself, or a change in the economic times which will make all Australians feel that everything's okay again. Mind you, I must admit that with the recent changes in the migration policy as announced by immigration policy announced by Mr. Herford, I wondered if the spirits of Edmund Barton and King O'Malley hadn't risen from the past. But just to return to this issue of Asians in today's Australia, in 1795, Edmund Burke wrote to William Smith and said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." I believe that discrimination, prejudice, and racial hatred are evil. And I think that the promotion, the generation, the fabrication of those evils is evil. But what can people of goodwill do? Well, firstly, I think we need to know the needs of our newest neighbours. And that, of course, requires research, not just by academics and public servants, but by voluntary agencies as well, so that it is talked about at grassroots level. Secondly, I believe we have to be concerned not only with the quality of the personal life of the migrant, but with the community life of the migrant. And I think far too many Australians adopt the attitude, aren't they lucky to be here? At least they've got a roof, a bed and a feed. And no one's denying that. But I think if we cherish this Australian way of life at all, we ought not only to cherish the quality of the private life of the individual, we ought to cherish the community life of those individuals who make up the community. We need to make time to cross the barriers and mix and encourage the new settlers to do the same. Don't wait for the media or some government department to make the move. It will probably be more effective if it comes from the neighbours or a small group able to act in that neighbourly fashion. It may be possible that some of the earlier migrants could, as an ethnic group, extend a hand to the more recent arrivals. Mind you, I have a suspicion that there probably is as much resentment amongst some older migrant people towards the newcomers as there is amongst some unthinking people born in this country. Thirdly, let's all accept the challenge of tomorrow's society. It's so easy to leave it to them. That mythical committee, that government department, politicians, community organisations relied upon by everybody to do everything. Them. Why don't they do something? Someone once said, we should all be concerned about the future because we'll have to spend the rest of our lives there. I can think of no area in the life of our world which requires us to be concerned about the future more important than that area of relationships with one another. Not just Asian migrant people or Greek migrant people or South American migrant people or British migrant people, but that area of relationships with one another as an Australian community. In the light of the violence and the hatred and the brutality that we're seeing spreading like a grotesque stain across our world, unless we learn the fundamentals of tolerance and understanding, I shudder to contemplate the future. But you don't have to go to Beirut or Frankfurt or Belfast or South Africa. We can all start in our own way, in our own street, our own suburb, and our own city. Thank you.